"I never thought it would come to this," Michael Perry whispered, moments before his execution. These final words, spoken in a Texas death chamber, marked the tragic end of a young man whose fate was sealed by his own horrifying actions. Actions that took 3 innocent lives in one night. What led him from being an ordinary, troubled boy to the man standing at the center of a triple murder case? The answer is as chilling as the crime itself. This is the haunting story of 2 Texas teenagers, Michael Perry and Jason Burkett, who went from ordinary, lost boys to cold-blooded killers in a single fateful night in October 2001. Beneath the surface of their small community lives, Michael and Jason carried deep-rooted trauma and anger. What began as a seemingly harmless desire for better cars quickly spiraled into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. In less than 24 hours, they would shock the world and devastate 3 families forever. In this video, we'll break down this twisted tale step by step, exploring the darkness that led these young men to commit such horrific acts. We'll uncover how their broken lives and overwhelming hardship twisted into a deadly plan that claimed the lives of 3 innocent people. As we walk through the detailed events of the crime, the investigation, and the legal battles that followed, we'll shed light on the human tragedy and the lasting impact it had on the families who lost everything. Michael Perry's life was troubled from the very beginning. Adopted as a child, he was raised in a loving family. But his struggles began early and were pronounced. He was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, ADD. By 1st grade, battling an inability to focus and sit still that caused constant conflict. His mental health issues quickly escalated. By 7th grade, he was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, a condition marked by open defiance and hostility toward any authority figure. The rebellion was more than just a phase. It was a symptom of something darker and more pervasive. In 8th grade, doctors labeled him with conduct disorder, a severe form of behavioral trouble that often leads to chronic antisocial behavior and violent tendencies. His parents, desperate and unsure how to help their son, tried everything imaginable: counseling, therapy, and even repeated stays in institutional care became a regular part of Michael's life. Yet nothing seemed to work. The violence and anger in Michael only grew more intense. He began stealing from his adoptive mother, including her jewelry, which he attempted to sell. He even crashed the family vehicle into a mailbox in a reckless act of defiance. When regular schools couldn't handle his increasingly disruptive behavior, his parents sent him to Boys Town in Nebraska, a well-known reform school for troubled youth. But even here, Michael's dark side showed. After just 3 months, he made a chilling, prophetic threat to the staff. "You people work here. I don't know why people like me are going to rape or kill your kids." This severe threat resulted in his placement in the locked section of the facility for 4 months. Tragically, the time in a facility designed to correct his behavior only seemed to escalate his underlying issues. By the time he turned 18, Michael had been through several treatment programs. He left Casa by the Sea, a private facility in Mexico, with a high school diploma, but he quickly walked away from the program entirely. He found himself on the streets of San Diego, homeless and alone. With no identification, no job skills, and no legitimate way to survive, Michael made a series of desperate choices that would define the rest of his short life. Jason Burkett's early life was an absolute nightmare, shaped by a profound neglect, escalating violence in an intensely abusive home. Born to a mother who used methamphetamine during pregnancy, Jason's start was marked by the lingering effects of her substance abuse. His critical developmental years were further harmed by a lack of care and attention from his mother, who frequently left her older children to raise the younger ones. However, it was his father, Delbert Burkett, who cast the darkest and most lasting shadow. Delbert was a career criminal with a volatile and violent temperament who routinely turned their small home into a war zone. Jason witnessed unspeakable acts. He watched in horror as his father regularly beat his mother, and on at least one occasion, he saw Delbert shoot her with a pellet gun. The violence was not confined to his mother. Jason and his siblings were also regularly beaten by their father, a pattern of sustained abuse that continued relentlessly throughout their childhood. The Burkett home was perpetually supported by food stamps and perpetually dominated by fear. Yet, in a deeply disturbing psychological twist common among victims of abuse, Jason grew to idolize his brutal father. His emotional turmoil was compounded by his siblings, who, themselves scarred by the same traumatic abuse, often passed their emotional trauma and instability down to him. Despite growing up in an environment overflowing with violence and neglect, Jason's bond with Delbert was his only semblance of connection in an otherwise shattered life. By his teenage years, the severe effects of his tumultuous upbringing were painfully clear. Jason had internalized the deadly belief that violence was a normal and expected part of life. His relationship with his father and the horrifying abuse he witnessed left him with no moral compass, no stable framework for understanding right and wrong. This twisted perspective on life would soon play a significant and fatal role in the crimes he would commit. Michael Perry and Jason Burkett were both profoundly damaged, broken young men when they found each other. They had little in common on the surface, but the shared weight of their troubled, violent past formed an unspoken, immediate bond. Michael, reeling from his mental health battles and years of failed correction attempts, found a kindred spirit in Jason. Likewise, Jason, raised in a home of neglect and violence, saw in Michael someone who viscerally understood his own anger and despair. Together, they forged a toxic friendship rooted deeply in mutual frustration and burning resentment toward the world that had seemingly abandoned them. They both felt out of place, misunderstood, and desperate for change. But their idea of change was entirely destructive. The anger and frustration they both carried with them began to focus inward, but it wasn't long before that destructive energy turned sharply outward, at society, at the world that had seemingly turned its back on them. The relationship wasn't just about survival, it was about justification. They found in each other the perfect license to act on their very worst impulses. They bonded over a shared love for drugs and a taste for minor crime, each feeding the other's darker desires. Michael's reckless, explosive anger, fueled by his mental health issues, met Jason's ingrained violence and complete disregard for legal or moral boundaries. Their growing friendship was a profoundly dangerous combination. They quickly became inseparable. It wasn't long before their conversations shifted from simple daily frustrations to lethal plans that would change the course of their lives forever. With nothing left to lose and no moral compass to guide them, Michael and Jason began discussing their desire for better lives and how they could make that happen, by any means necessary. Their shared goals, their shared need for an escape, began to take a deadly, irreversible turn. Michael and Jason were desperate. They had no stable futures, no prospects, and felt trapped in the miserable lives they were living. Both were struggling with addiction and criminal records that made legitimate employment an impossible dream. In their minds, they saw a simple, immediate solution to their problems. They wanted better cars. The stolen cars represented a way out, a brief, glittering escape from their dismal reality. A red Camaro and an Isuzu Rodeo, parked in a quiet, affluent, gated community, became the perfect targets. The conversation started innocently enough, talking about how they could steal them. But beneath the talk of boosting vehicles lay a growing, simmering rage. They were tired of being overlooked, tired of struggling. And in their minds, these vehicles, these seemingly small material possessions, became a potent symbol of everything they wanted, but could never have through legal means. Perry and Burkett didn't just want the cars. They wanted to prove to themselves and the world that they could take what they felt they deserved. They were driven not just by greed, but by a deeper, darker sense of entitlement. They were prepared to do whatever it took. And by October 24, 2001, the plan had been solidified. The simple plan for car theft quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous and sinister. Michael and Jason arrived at Sandra Stotler's beautiful home. After parking the truck they had driven, they initially left, having learned that Sandra's son, Adam, wouldn't be home for another couple of hours. The timing wasn't right for the robbery they had planned. But as they stood there, uncertainty quickly turned into reckless desperation. They had driven this far. Why wait for the perfect moment when they could take what they wanted now? Their desperation drove them back to the Stotler home. Michael and Jason decided to take matters into their own hands, no longer willing to wait for Adam. They returned to the house, now armed with a shotgun. Jason knocked on the front door, creating a loud diversion that occupied Sandra. While Michael snuck into the garage, he retrieved the shotgun they had brought with them, knowing that the stakes were about to change from theft to violence. Sandra Stotler, a kind mother who worked as a dedicated nurse, was completely unaware that she was about to become the first victim of a brutal, senseless crime. When she opened the back door to check who was knocking, Michael was already waiting, the shotgun raised in his hands. The first shot hit Sandra before she could even react, sending her crashing violently to the garage ground. But even wounded, Sandra was stronger and more determined than Michael expected. She fought, trying desperately to get up. The second shot ended her struggle instantly, silencing the woman who had spent her life saving others. Michael and Jason weren't finished. With disturbing coldness, they covered her body with sheets from her own home and loaded her into the truck, treating her body like discarded furniture. They drove to Crater Lake and dumped her body, a chilling attempt to erase the evidence of their monstrous crime. But they weren't done yet. They still needed to complete their initial mission: steal the two cars. After Sandra Stotler's brutal murder, Michael and Jason's plan continued to unfold, taking an even darker, more ruthless turn. They still needed the stolen vehicles, which had become potent symbols of their intended escape. However, they faced an immediate challenge: the high security gates of the Bentwater subdivision. The community was designed to keep unwanted visitors out, and Michael and Jason couldn't simply drive into the neighborhood without the entry code, which they didn't have. They parked their truck in the stolen Isuzu down the street and began waiting for Adam Stotler to return. They realized the plan had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about stealing cars. They had crossed a fatal line and were committed to seeing it through, whatever the cost. The hours dragged on, and the pair grew more desperate, discussing how they would gain access to the house and steal the keys to the Camaro. They were shockingly unaware of how deeply they had already spiraled into a night of irreversible, violent consequences. When Adam Stotler finally arrived at the gate with his best friend Jeremy Richardson in tow, Michael and Jason flagged them down. They fabricated a calculated and urgent lie about a friend who had been shot in the woods. The two boys, Adam and Jeremy, instantly trusting the judgment and story of the two older teens, followed them without question, eager to help someone in need. They had no idea that this seemingly innocent request for help was a meticulously calculated trap, and that their lives were about to be ripped away in an instant. Michael and Jason led the victims down the darkened, secluded streets of the Bentwater community, promising that the situation was dire. The trusting teenagers followed them straight into the woods. The moment the four of them arrived in the woods, the plan shifted decisively from theft to execution. Jason, carrying the gun, shot Jeremy Richardson first. The 18-year-old was caught completely off guard, in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply trying to be a good friend. Before Adam could even comprehend the horror unfolding in front of him, he was next. Jason walked over to him, asked him a chilling, almost rhetorical question. "Did you hear those gunshots?" Before he raised the gun and shot Adam 3 times, ending his life in the cold darkness of the woods. The two boys, once full of promise, lay dead, victims of a crime set in motion by nothing more than a desire for material possessions. Michael Perry, without hesitation or apparent remorse, rifled through Adam's pockets. He took his wallet and car keys, treating the act of stealing from a dead body as nothing more than a routine, necessary step in his night of destruction. He and Jason then drove away, taking the Isuzu Rodeo and leaving behind 2 more bodies. They were no longer just thieves, they were triple killers. With the stolen keys to the Camaro in hand, Michael and Jason headed back to the Stotler house. They took the red Camaro, driving away with a sense of grim accomplishment, as if they had somehow won. They drove to a nightclub, attempting to push the horrifying reality of the night to the back of their minds, but the weight of the crime would follow them relentlessly. For 2 days, Michael Perry thought he had gotten away with the murders, driving around in the stolen Camaro, the vehicle now a chilling symbol of his criminal triumph. But his luck quickly ran out. On October 26, 2001, his fate caught up with him when a police officer in Houston spotted him committing a traffic violation. The officer attempted to pull him over, but Michael, panicked and desperate, led police on a high-speed chase that ultimately ended when he crashed the Camaro. He attempted to flee the wreckage on foot but was quickly apprehended. During the arrest, police made the crucial discovery. They found Adam Stotler's wallet in Michael Perry's pocket, an undeniable piece of evidence tying him directly to the crime. Michael initially gave police Adam's name, mistakenly identifying himself as one of his victims. The officers were not fooled, and they soon realized they had the key suspect in the recent disappearance. 2 days later, the bodies of Sandra Stotler, Adam, and Jeremy were formally discovered, and the horrifying scope of the triple murder was made clear to the public. Michael Perry and Jason Burkett were now firmly in the spotlight, charged with capital murder. Michael's initial confidence crumbled under intense interrogation. At first, he denied any involvement, but as the interrogation continued, he eventually broke down and provided a full, detailed confession. His meticulous account of the events of October 24th, from the planning to the execution of the murders, left little room for doubt. He even described specific details, such as where the bodies were dumped and how he had taken Adam's wallet, that had not been released to the public. His confession matched the physical evidence already gathered from the crime scenes. Even more chilling was Michael's apparent lack of remorse, which cemented his role as a cold, calculated killer. However, realizing the gravity of his situation, Michael's story soon began to shift. He started claiming his confession had been coerced by detectives and tried to shift the blame entirely onto Jason, portraying himself as a passive participant manipulated into going along with Jason's violent rampage. Despite these changing, self-serving stories, the overwhelming evidence against him remained irrefutable. Jason Burkett, on the other hand, was not as forthcoming. He was arrested days later at a truck stop with the stolen Isuzu Rodeo. While he initially denied his involvement, he too was confronted with the weight of the evidence. Witness testimony, most critically from his girlfriend Kristen Willis, who had been present during the killings but was too scared to intervene, placed him and Michael at the scene. Jason also began to deflect responsibility, pointing to his traumatic childhood and the horrific abuse he suffered at the hands of his father as the root cause of his violent actions, arguing that his life of neglect had permanently warped his sense of morality. The physical evidence sealed both their fates. Forensic analysis confirmed Michael's DNA at the crime scene, his fingerprints on the stolen vehicles, and his DNA on a cigarette butt discovered near a victim. The investigation painted a detailed picture of two young men whose troubled environments, Michael's mental health issues and Jason's abusive childhood, had tragically converged into a deadly force. The trial of Michael Perry began in early 2003. It was widely considered an open and shut case given the overwhelming evidence, with his detailed confession serving as the prosecution's cornerstone. The prosecution presented a chilling portrait of Michael's actions, detailing the 3 murders and emphasizing his cold, calculated approach and profound lack of remorse. Michael's defense team attempted to argue that the confession was coerced, but they lacked substantial evidence to support this claim. The jury was unconvinced. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Michael Perry guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, the jury faced the difficult choice between life in prison and the death penalty. While the defense presented evidence of Michael's troubled upbringing, the prosecution successfully argued that his actions were deliberate and calculated. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before unanimously deciding that Michael should receive the death penalty. Despite his youth, the brutality of his crimes and the overwhelming evidence of his guilt led them to this conclusion. Michael was taken to the Huntsville unit in Texas to begin his years on death row. Jason Burkett's trial followed, and while the evidence against him was equally strong, his defense team adopted a radically different approach. They did not attempt to deny his involvement, but sought to mitigate his responsibility by focusing almost entirely on his traumatic, abusive childhood. Jason's lawyers painted a heart-wrenching picture of a young man irreparably damaged by years of abuse and neglect. They presented powerful testimony from psychologists and family members emphasizing the horrors Jason had witnessed growing up. In an emotional climax, his father, Delbert Burkett, himself a convicted criminal, took the stand and tearfully admitted, "I was a horrible father. I failed my son and my family." The sight of this broken man begging for mercy for his son seemed to have a powerful effect on the jury, forcing them to consider that Jason was, in large part a product of his devastating environment. The question became not whether Jason was guilty, but how severely he should be punished. After deliberating for several hours, the jury reached a narrow decision. Jason Burkett would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was tight, with just 2 votes separating life from death, sparing Jason the executioner's needle. The contrast between Michael's death sentence and Jason's life sentence was stark, raising difficult, enduring questions about justice and the role of childhood trauma in criminal responsibility. The execution of Michael Perry was preceded by years of failed legal battles and appeals. Michael consistently maintained his innocence, claiming he was framed, but the evidence against him remained irrefutable. On July 1, 2010, Michael Perry's execution day finally arrived. At 6:03 p.m., he was led into the Huntsville death chamber, strapped to the gurney, and prepared for lethal injection. Behind the glass, the families of his victims, the Stotlers and the Richardsons, watched, waiting for the moment that would bring finality to years of devastating grief. His adoptive mother, Gail Perry, was also there. Michael's final statement was brief but telling. He said, "I want to start off by saying to everyone involved in this atrocity that they are all forgiven by me," incredibly framing his own execution as the atrocity rather than the monstrous triple murder he committed. He then looked through the glass at his adoptive mother. "Mom, I love you. I'm coming home, Dad. Coming home, Dad." A single tear rolled down his cheek as the lethal injection began. At 6:17 p.m., Michael Perry was pronounced dead at the age of 28. For Sandra's daughter, Lisa Ballon, Michael Perry's execution brought mixed and complicated emotions. "When he said he forgave us, I knew that he was the monster I had made him out to be," she said afterward, the final act of defiance confirming the depth of his detachment. The execution brought a strange kind of closure, but it could never fill the permanent void left by the loss of her mother and brother. While Michael's life was extinguished, Jason Burkett's story continued behind prison walls. His sentence was a victory for the argument that environment can mitigate accountability, yet his actions in prison often reinforced the idea that he remained deeply connected to the criminal world. In 2018, his girlfriend was arrested for attempting to smuggle methamphetamine into the prison for him, a dark reminder that the cycle of addiction and crime was far from over. Jason will not be eligible for parole until November 2041, at which point he will be nearly 60 years old. His role in the murders of Sandra, Adam, and Jeremy will forever define him. The tragedy of the triple murder left a permanent scar on the community of Montgomery County. Bentwater, once a symbol of peace and security, had its illusion of safety shattered forever. The case of Michael Perry and Jason Burkett remains a painful, tragic tale, one that raises difficult questions about justice and mercy, and what constitutes true accountability for those shaped by forces beyond their control. The true cost is measured not just in the lives lost, but in the families and community forever altered by the senseless violence of 2 broken young men.